I'm Nora Blake, 19 years old, and the last photograph of my graduation is the one nobody took. The caps were still drifting over the football field when my parents said we were short on time and steered the SUV toward County Road 12. We rolled past the grain silos and the old rail crossing windows, fogged from the June heat, my gown still damp against my arms. At the edge of town, a single streetlight buzzed over a dented bench and a cracked timetable. My mother turned and smiled the way you smile at the bank teller. My father placed the car in park without looking back. My sister clicked her gum and watched me in the glass. 10 minutes later, I was standing alone with a folded diploma and a paper bill curled in my palm. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if you've ever had to build your life without the people who were supposed to be proud of you. I grew up in a small Indiana town where summer smells like cut hay and motor oil, and most families teach their kids to wave at every pickup that passes. Mine taught me to stay quiet and not take up space. Dad came home with grit in the lines of his hands and stories about carburetors that would not behave. Mom kept the books at an insurance office where the coffee always tasted a little burnt, and my sister Vanna glowed like a porch light everyone gathered around. When Vanna turned 16, a used sedan appeared in our driveway with a bow tied to the antenna. On my 16th birthday, Mom slid a bookstore gift card across the table and said, "You like to read, honey." That was the rhythm of our house attention pooled, where it was already bright, and the rest of us learned to move quietly through the shadow. I did my best work in the garage after dinner, where the air smelled like rubber and rain, taking apart busted radios and coaxing them to hum again, dreaming of machines I might one day build. My teachers noticed long before my family did. A science fair ribbon hung crooked over my desk for a low-cost water filter I'd put together with hardware scraps and stubbornness. At home, the ribbon made a soft tapping sound in the breeze of the box fan, while the TV in the living room drowned it out. When an acceptance letter came from a university clear on the coast, a partial scholarship in engineering, I held the envelope like it was glass and carried it to the kitchen. Mom skimmed it and said Seattle sounded too far and engineering wasn't really for girls. Dad rustled the newspaper and told me to be realistic, and Vanna laughed that I should major in reading since I was always tucked behind a book. I kept my tone even, the way you do when noise can get you labeled difficult, and I told them I would find a way. That night in the soft hum of the garage, a little coil of resolve warmed my chest, like the first glow in a cold engine. We weren't rich, but that wasn't the thing that divided us. It was the way love was distributed, like there wasn't enough to go around, and every extra smile at Vanna's achievements took something away from everyone else. I learned how to clock out early from my own joy. I learned how to make meals stretch. I learned that if I wanted something steady, I'd have to build it. I took a part-time job at the hardware store and watched delivery schedules like they were puzzles, seeing lines where other people saw errands writing notes in a pocket spiral I kept tucked under the register. On Sundays, I sat in the public library near the tall windows and read about circuits and supply chains on a slow computer that hiccuped every time the weather changed, tracing diagrams with my finger like prayers. The distance between the world I wanted and the one I was standing in felt widest at the dinner table. We had 4 wooden chairs and 1 metal folding chair that squeaked when you breathed, and somehow the metal one drifted toward me each night. When Vanna told a story, the room leaned in. When I tried to share mine, the TV grew louder, or the salt was suddenly out of reach. The first time I heard Mom tell my aunt on the phone that you can't spoil both girls, Vanna's the one who'll make something of herself. I stood in the doorway with a dish towel in my hand and felt something small and necessary click into place. If no one was going to choose me, I would at least choose myself. Graduation came with the thrum of cicadas and the weight of a gown that never fit quite right, the stadium lights glaring over damp grass and fresh futures. My classmates planned dinners and late-night drives to the lake. My parents said we had an errand and pulled out of the parking lot before the traffic began. We passed the old diner, where the neon flickered the thrift shop with the mannequins tilted in the window, the little convenience store where the clerk knows your last name, and then the SUV slowed under that single humming light. The sign said the next bus wouldn't come until 10:45. My mother reached across the console and pressed a wrinkled $10 bill into my palm. My father kept the engine running. Vanna watched my reflection in the glass, then looked away. The door latch clicked, the air shifted, and the gravel under my shoes made a sound I will never forget. I stepped toward the bench and the taillights slid into the dark like a promise I would never be asked to keep. The sound of their tires faded long before the silence did. For a while I just stood there beneath the dim streetlight, watching the dust settle where the car had been. The bench beside me was chipped and cold, the air heavy with the smell of rain on asphalt. In one hand I still held the folded $10 bill, in the other the plastic sleeve that protected my diploma. The night pressed close, and it felt as if the whole town had turned its back at once. When the first drop of rain hit the paper, I tucked it under my arm and walked toward the tiny convenience store across the road, the only place with its lights still on. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old coffee and bleach. A middle-aged clerk sat behind the counter, half asleep, flipping through a newspaper. I bought the cheapest sandwich I could find and a bottle of water. When he handed me the change, 2 singles and a handful of coins, I realized that was all the money I had in the world. Outside, I found a dry corner under the broken awning and sat down to eat. Each bite tasted of stale bread and something sour, but it was enough to quiet the ache in my stomach. Cars passed every few minutes, their headlights sweeping over the wet pavement before vanishing into the dark. For each one, a small part of me hoped it would slow down, that someone might roll down a window and ask if I needed help. None did. The rain grew heavier, drumming on the metal roof above me. I pulled off the graduation gown, folded it neatly, and used it as a makeshift pillow against my backpack. Across the street, the yellow glow of the bus schedule flickered like a weak heartbeat. I tried to remember the times listed there, but my eyes blurred from exhaustion. Somewhere between the steady rhythm of the rain and the far-off hum of the highway, I whispered to myself, "If nobody's coming back, I'll just have to keep moving forward." The words barely made a sound, but they filled the quiet in a way that steadied me. When dawn came, it painted the wet pavement in pale gold. My clothes clung damp to my skin, and the air smelled like rust and morning dew. The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes, its windows fogged, its driver yawning behind the wheel. He looked at me with a mix of surprise and concern. "You getting on?" he asked. I didn't even know where it was going, but I nodded. The steps creaked under my weight, and when the doors closed behind me, I felt something invisible snap. Whatever thin thread had tied me to home was gone. The bus took me 30 miles west to a town whose name I didn't know until I saw it on a street sign, Cedar Hollow. Rows of small houses lined the road, paint-fading porches leaning. There were a few stores, a laundromat, and a diner that smelled like frying onions even from outside. I wandered for hours, my backpack growing heavier with each block until the sun began to dip again. Hunger gnawed at me, sharper than fear. I stopped at the diner, its window fogged with steam, and pushed the door open. The woman behind the counter looked up from the coffee pot. She was short and round, her hair pulled back with a pencil stuck through it. Her name tag read, Alvarez's Diner, but she simply said, "Sit anywhere, honey. I didn't have enough for a meal, so I asked if she needed help instead." "You ever wash dishes?" she asked. I shook my head. "You learn fast," she pressed. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded toward the back. "Grab an apron from the hook. Don't quit before the rush is over." The first few hours passed in a blur of clattering plates, steam, and the sting of hot water on my hands. My fingers pruned, my back ached, and the smell of grease clung to my hair. Still, when she handed me a plate of scrambled eggs at the end of the night and said, "Eat before you go," I nearly cried. I didn't tell her that I didn't have a place to go. Instead, I thanked her and sat at the counter, the plate warm beneath my hands. When I finished eating, she nodded toward the storeroom. "There's an old cot behind the tomato crates," she said. "If you're too tired to walk home, use it. Just don't let the health inspector see." That room became my first shelter. I laid my gown over the cot as a blanket, the fabric still faintly smelling of rain, and fell asleep to the hum of the refrigerators. The next morning, I folded the apron neatly and walked out front ready before the sun came up. The woman, Miss Alvarez, didn't ask questions. She just handed me another apron and said, "Coffee's fresh. Don't burn yourself." Days turned into weeks. I worked through breakfast rushes and closing shifts, sometimes both. The other workers didn't talk much, but they nodded when I passed. There was a delivery driver named Ben who dropped off boxes of produce twice a week. He was tall, quiet, and older with a beard that looked like it had seen too many winters. One evening he caught me struggling to lift a tub of glasses and said, "Balance the weight with a tray. You'll last longer that way." After that, he'd leave an extra sandwich on the counter when he finished his deliveries. I never asked why. By the third week, my hands were red from soap and water, but I'd saved nearly $60. It wasn't much, but it felt like proof that I existed on my own terms. Miss Alvarez noticed I was still there after closing one night and said softly, "You've got nowhere else, do you?" I hesitated, then told her the truth in as few words as possible. She didn't react with pity. She just said, "Keep working hard. You'll figure it out." That quiet faith, spoken without a smile or hug, was more kindness than I'd heard from my own family in years. When I wasn't washing dishes, I scribbled in a small notebook I kept in my pocket. I wrote down the delivery times, the number of tables filled each hour, which routes Ben took when he came by. Patterns started to appear, how shipments ran late on certain days, how the breakfast crowd thinned when a storm rolled in. Noticing those patterns gave me a strange sense of control. One night, when Ben saw me jotting notes, he laughed. "You planning to run the place?" he asked. I smiled for the first time in weeks and said, "Just trying to understand how it all fits together." The next day, he sketched something on a napkin, a quick map of his delivery route. "See this line?" he said, tracing the curve with a calloused finger. "If I switch these 2 stops, I save half an hour. Less fuel, less wear on the truck." He pushed the napkin toward me. "There's a trick to everything, kid. You just have to find the pattern." I folded the napkin and tucked it inside my notebook. That night, lying on the cot, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the word he'd used, pattern. For the first time since the bus stop, I felt a quiet flicker of purpose. A month after I started, Miss Alvarez handed me my first envelope of cash. "Don't lose yourself chasing money," she said, her voice firm but kind. "But don't ever let it slip through your fingers either." I nodded and thanked her. That same afternoon, I went across the street to the thrift store and bought a navy blue backpack with sturdy straps. When I slung it over my shoulder, the weight felt different, not like survival, but progress. Each morning began before sunrise. Each night ended long after closing, yet I didn't mind. The diner became my school, the sink my desk, every plate a lesson in endurance. When I cleaned the last table and turned off the neon sign, the quiet outside felt less like loneliness and more like space to breathe. One evening, as I locked the back door, Ben was loading his truck nearby. He nodded toward me and said, "You're built tougher than most folks I meet on the road." I didn't know how to answer, so I just nodded back. That night, as the streetlights flickered over the wet pavement, I realized something had changed. I wasn't waiting for rescue anymore. I was moving, learning, shaping a life that might one day lead somewhere beyond these small streets. I thought of the bench at the bus stop, the $10 bill, the rain, and the promise I had whispered into the dark. And for the first time, I believed it might actually come true. When I lay down on the cot, the hum of the refrigerator felt like a heartbeat. My notebook rested beside me, the folded napkin tucked safely inside. Outside, a truck engine rumbled to life and faded down the road, its sound trailing like a reminder that every road begins somewhere, and mine had already started. The weeks turned into months, and life in Cedar Hollow settled into a kind of rhythm I could depend on. Morning light crept through the diner's greasy windows, catching in the steam that rose off plates stacked high with pancakes and bacon. The bell above the door rang constantly, a mix of farmers, truckers, and families drifting in and out. By evening, the crowd thinned, and I could finally breathe again as the air cooled and the scent of burnt coffee faded from the counter. The nights were quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rattle of rain against the back door. I slept on that old cot behind the tomato crates, the sound of trucks on the nearby highway echoing like a lullaby. Every day began and ended in that narrow space, but it was mine, my first corner of the world that no one could take away. Ben kept showing up with his delivery boxes steady as clockwork. Sometimes when the rush slowed, he'd lean on the counter and talk about the roads he'd driven that week. His stories painted a picture of America stitched together by asphalt and rest stops, the mountains out west, the wide plains through Kansas, the endless grids of cities he couldn't quite remember by name. He had the sort of calm that comes from seeing too much and still choosing kindness. Once he caught me scribbling in my notebook again, running numbers on paper napkins between wiping tables. "You're still tracking deliveries?" he asked, half teasing. I nodded, embarrassed. "You've got the look of someone who sees patterns," he said. "That's a gift most people miss." His words stayed with me long after he left. By the time my first winter in Cedar Hollow arrived, I had saved enough to rent a small room above a laundromat a few blocks away. The hallway smelled like detergent and floor wax, and the radiator clanged like it was fighting for life. But I had a door that locked a real bed and a small window that overlooked Main Street. I carried my backpack and gown up those stairs, spreading the gown across the mattress like a blanket. That night I watched the snow drift past the streetlight outside and realized I wasn't cold anymore. At the diner, Miss Alvarez noticed the change. "You've been moving faster lately," she said one morning while wiping down the counter. "You got someplace to be." I smiled a little and told her about the new room. She didn't say much, just nodded once and set a mug of coffee in front of me. "Good," she said. "Every bird needs a nest before it learns how to fly." She always spoke that way, short, sturdy sentences that said more than they seemed to. By then, I had filled 2 notebooks with my notes, delivery times, routes, how supplies arrived, and where they got delayed. On slow nights, I sat in the last booth sketching maps and rearranging schedules that didn't even belong to me. Ben noticed once when he dropped off a shipment late. "You're going to end up running someone's company if you keep that up," he said, half joking. "I don't think anyone's handing me a company," I replied. He tore off part of his manifest and drew another route sketch showing how a change in order could shave off a few miles. "Efficiency pays," he said with a grin. "Keep that in mind." It was a small moment, but something inside me clicked. I began to wonder if there was more I could do than scrub dishes. I didn't have a degree or money or even a proper reference beyond Miss Alvarez's firm nod, but I had one thing I'd never had before, a sense that I might actually be good at something. The idea grew quietly like a light behind fog. One afternoon, Ben came in during a snowstorm, his beard dusted white, and said, "A friend of mine runs a small freight company out near the highway. They need help organizing schedules. I could tell him about you if you're interested." I froze, unsure if I'd heard him right. "You do that?" I asked. He shrugged. "You've earned it. You think the diner's the only place that needs order." He left me the address scribbled on a napkin, same as he had with his delivery routes. That night I barely slept. The thought of walking into a real office terrified me. Still, 2 days later, I took the town bus to the edge of Cedar Hollow and found a small building with faded letters that read, "Everline Freight." The lot was filled with 6 old trucks and a single trailer parked half on the grass. Inside, maps covered the walls, each pinned with colored tacks, and the smell of diesel hung heavy in the air. A man in his early 50s looked up from his desk, tired eyes behind thick glasses. "You must be Nora," he said. Ben called ahead. "I'm Tom Whitman." He scanned the scrap of paper that passed for my resume and let out a short breath through his nose. "No experience, huh?" he said. "But you kept his roots straight for him, apparently." I nodded, unsure whether to speak. After a pause, he said, "All right. Minimum wage 2 days a week. You keep the numbers clean. We'll see what happens." It wasn't much, but to me it felt like the door to another world had cracked open. The first weeks at Everline were chaotic. Drivers came and went at all hours, paperwork piled high, and the phones never stopped ringing. I sat at a second-hand computer entering delivery logs, tracking mileage, and updating routes on maps, so old they were patched with tape. Tom moved between desks like a man who had forgotten how to slow down. Once, when I rearranged a list of stops so the drivers could hit all 3 counties without backtracking, he stopped beside my chair. "You just saved us 40 minutes on Route 6, he said. "How'd you figure that?" I pointed at the map. They were crossing the highway twice for no reason. He gave a low whistle and said, "Keep doing whatever that is." My life split into 2 tracks, then mornings at the diner, evenings at Everline. I barely saw daylight except through bus windows. Some nights I walked home under the glow of the street lamps, hands raw from soap and keyboard keys, but my chest felt steady. I was finally part of something that moved something bigger than me. Tom started letting me stay late to learn dispatch basics, how to track freight weights, calculate time delays, and check weather reports before approving routes. It was quiet work, the kind that required patience and calm, but I loved it. One evening, long after everyone else had gone home, I found myself staring at the big map of Indiana pinned to the wall. Each red pin marked a destination, every thin string between them a route that someone had to drive. I traced the lines with my fingertip, thinking how every mile on that board represented someone's effort, someone's hope. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. For a moment, I could almost hear the sound of engines moving through the dark, the soft thunder of progress. I whispered to myself, "Someday I'll be the one directing the routes, not cleaning up after them." When Tom came in the next morning and saw the reworked schedule I'd printed overnight, he stopped in his tracks. "You did this?" he asked. I nodded, half afraid I'd overstepped. He studied the layout for a long moment, then said, "Looks better than mine." From that day forward, he started calling me his apprentice. He taught me to read fuel costs, negotiate driver hours, and handle late deliveries without losing patience. Every week, he gave me a little more responsibility. It wasn't glamorous, but I started to believe I could build a future from it. Back at the diner, Miss Alvarez noticed the change. "You look different," she said one evening when I came in for a quick coffee after my shift at Everline. "Tired, but taller somehow." I smiled and said, "Maybe I finally know where I'm going." She gave a knowing look and said, "Don't forget where you started. Pride is quiet work too." By spring, Everline had added 2 new trucks and expanded into neighboring counties. Tom trusted me to plan their weekly routes. Sometimes when I locked up the office at night, I stood on the steps and watched the highway lights flicker in the distance, thinking about all the paths that might still be waiting. The girl who once stood at a bus stop with nothing but a backpack had learned how to chart directions for others. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the start of something that finally felt like it could last. That summer, Tom asked if I'd consider learning more about dispatch management. "You've got a mind for order," he said, "and people notice it." I looked at him, realizing I'd never heard anyone talk about me that way before. He handed me a spare set of office keys and said, "You're part of this place now. Don't waste the chance." I walked home that night under a sky streaked with late clouds, the warm air carrying the smell of rain and diesel. My notebook was tucked in my bag, filled with more routes than pages left. Each line on those maps told the story of how far I'd come. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was building the foundation of the person I was meant to become. Still somewhere deep down, I knew it wouldn't stop here. Something was shifting quietly, steadily, like a road curving toward a destination I couldn't yet see. And whatever waited at the end of that curve, I was finally ready to meet it. By the time my second year at Everline Freight began, I had stopped counting the days since the night at the bus stop. Survival had become motion, and motion had become progress. Each morning the trucks rumbled out of the lot like clockwork engines cutting through the fog that clung to the highway. I arrived before sunrise, sorting route sheets and updating the dispatch board while the coffee maker sputtered to life. The air always smelled of diesel and rain-soaked asphalt, and I loved it. For the first time, I knew exactly where I fit in the world. Tom had started trusting me with more responsibility, handling incoming calls, solving driver delays, and negotiating fuel adjustments. He called me his calm in the storm, though I still worked twice as hard to earn that trust every day. I kept learning, reading everything I could find about supply chains, mapping systems, and scheduling software. I even took the library's free online courses, downloading lessons to study after midnight. The more I understood how the whole network worked, the more it fascinated me. Every road, every stop, every timing adjustment, it was like a puzzle that could finally be solved if you were patient enough. One afternoon, while I was reviewing driver logs, Tom leaned against the doorway of my cubicle. "Ever think about finishing school?" he asked. I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression stayed serious. "There's a scholarship program for people already in logistics," he said. "They're looking for folks who've proven themselves in the field. I put your name in." I froze mid-sentence, unsure whether to thank him or argue. "You did what I said." He smiled faintly. "You've earned it, Nora. Don't sell yourself short." A month later, I opened my inbox and saw the email that made my hands shake. I'd been awarded a full scholarship for an online certification in supply chain and logistics management. It didn't seem real until the packet arrived in the mail, a letter with my name printed neatly across the top, followed by the words, "Congratulations, you've been accepted." I sat on the edge of my bed holding that paper until the sun went down, letting it sink in that for the first time, someone had seen potential in me and decided it was worth investing in. Classes began the following week. My schedule became a rotation of work lectures and more work. I'd finish my shift at Everline, walk home, make coffee, and stay up past midnight watching video lessons about freight optimization and predictive routing. The more I learned, the clearer everything became. It was as if all the late nights at the diner, all the years of being ignored, had quietly prepared me for this exact thing. I began applying the lessons right away, redesigning Everline's weekly route board, introducing tracking spreadsheets calculating fuel efficiency by driver. Within a few months, our delivery times improved by almost 10%. Tom noticed. "You're turning this place into a real operation," he said, half proud and half amazed. The scholarship covered more than tuition. It gave me access to online libraries, software demos, and mentors who answered questions I never thought I'd be able to ask. One night, while helping a local florist deliver Valentine's arrangements, I realized how much inefficiency surrounded small businesses. The drivers zigzagged across town, wasting time and gas because they didn't know how to plan their routes. That observation stuck with me. I went home and started sketching an idea in my notebook, a simple digital tool that could calculate the shortest delivery path between multiple stops. Nothing fancy, just practical. I had no budget and no formal training in coding, but the same persistence that once kept me scrubbing dishes now kept me glued to that old laptop for hours. I read free tutorials, watched videos, and taught myself the basics of programming. Slowly, piece by piece, the system began to work. I named it SwiftRoute because all I wanted in those early days was to move forward swiftly and not look back. When I finally tested the prototype with Ben, I held my breath as he entered his list of addresses. The app rearranged his stops in seconds. He raised his eyebrows and said, "If this thing saves me fuel, you're a genius." 3 days later, he came back grinning. 20% less gas, he said. "You might be onto something." Word spread through town faster than I expected. A bakery, 2 florists, and a produce distributor all asked if they could try it. I charged a small subscription fee to cover hosting costs, and each new customer sent me a note afterward describing how much smoother their deliveries had become. It was modest, but it was real. Every message felt like a tiny spark proof that something I'd built could make a difference. One evening when the first official contract arrived from a small food wholesaler, I printed it, signed it carefully, and taped a copy above my desk. Next to it, I framed the same $10 bill my mother had given me the night she left me at the bus stop. The paper was torn and faded, but it was still there, my first and only investment. Every time I looked at it, I remembered exactly how far I'd come. SwiftRoute slowly grew from an idea into a real business. Tom helped me with contracts, Ben connected me with new clients, and Miss Alvarez even started using it to schedule her diner deliveries. "Makes my life easier," she said, patting my arm with a proud smile. I rented a tiny workspace, a spare room above the old post office, and turned it into an office with 1 desk, 1 computer, and too many coffee mugs. Most nights I stayed there until sunrise, working through bugs in the system and responding to customer feedback. When I finally launched a small website, I wrote the tagline myself, "Smart Routes for Small Hands at the Wheel." By the time I turned 24, I had more than 50 active users and a growing reputation across the region. I still worked part-time at Everline to help Tom during peak seasons, but my focus was shifting. The first time I opened the SwiftRoute dashboard and saw 1,000 active deliveries running across Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, I sat frozen, staring at the map until the early hours of the morning. Tiny, glowing dots crawled across highways like fireflies, each one a driver finding their way home a little faster. I whispered, "Look at that," and couldn't help but smile. The recognition came quietly at first, a local business feature in the Cedar Hollow Gazette, a call from a Midwestern trade group, then a short radio interview. It felt surreal hearing my own voice describe something that had once existed only on scraps of paper. When a reporter asked what inspired me to create SwiftRoute, I simply said I got tired of waiting for someone else to draw the map. The line stuck. People started repeating it. That same year, I changed my last name legally from Blake to Gray. It wasn't an act of rebellion, it was a declaration of peace. Blake belonged to the girl left at a bus stop. Gray felt balanced, something built entirely by my own hands. The change went unnoticed by my family, who still hadn't reached out in years. Sometimes I wondered if they'd even recognize me now, if they'd drive right past the office without knowing that the name on the sign belonged to their daughter. But wondering never lasted long. I had work to do, people depending on me and a company to grow. When I walked through that office at night, the hum of computers replaced the clatter of diner plates. I thought about all the people who had helped me along the way, Miss Alvarez with her quiet trust, Ben with his patient lessons, Tom with his steady belief. None of them had asked for anything in return. They just wanted to see me succeed. That simple kindness shaped everything Swift Route stood for. The evening I signed the contract that expanded our operations to 12 states, I opened the old frame that held the $10 bill and added something new beside it, the scan of my first signed client agreement. Two symbols side by side, what I'd been given and what I'd built. I looked at them and said softly, "This is the map now." Outside the window, rain pattered gently against the glass. The city lights glowed in reflection, and I thought about how strange it was that every storm, every disappointment had somehow carried me here. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted by the past. I felt anchored by it. The bus stop was still there, somewhere rusted and quiet, but now it was only the starting line of a road I had drawn myself. And as the night deepened, I could feel something shifting again, the faint pull of change, the sense that my journey was about to circle back to where it all began. Swift Route had grown faster than I could have imagined. What began as an app built from sleepless nights and secondhand laptops had turned into a logistics platform trusted by hundreds of small businesses across several states. Our office in Seattle was bright and open, the kind of place that smelled like fresh coffee and quiet determination. 50 employees filled the space, dispatchers, developers, analysts, each of them carrying the same drive I'd once seen in myself behind a diner sink. The hum of keyboards replaced the clang of dishes, and the glow of monitors mirrored the headlights that used to guide me home. Every time I walked through those glass doors, I remembered the long road that had brought me here. One morning, my assistant handed me a glossy envelope marked Northwest Business Journal. Inside was a formal letter and a headline printed in bold, "From Bus Stop to CEO, the woman who rewired small-town logistics." My chest tightened. I hadn't expected the story to reach that far. A journalist had visited weeks earlier to write about small business innovation, but I hadn't realized my own history had become the centerpiece. I sat at my desk reading the article line by line, the early years, the diner, the first client, the map of glowing routes stretching across the Midwest. It was all there, even the quote they'd pulled from our interview, "If no one draws a path for you, draw your own." Emails began flooding in within hours. Congratulations from clients, messages from old coworkers, and a dozen speaking invitations from conferences I'd never heard of. Somewhere in that growing pile of attention, one thought surfaced, and wouldn't leave me alone, my family would see it. I hadn't spoken to them in nearly a decade. My name change might have hidden me for a while, but the photo in the magazine, me standing beside a wall map of Swift Route's network, was unmistakable. My mother's silver eyes, my father's jawline, even my sister's smirk, had once framed faces that looked like mine. The past had a way of finding you, even when you'd buried it under success. 2 weeks later, the proof came in the simplest way possible, a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Hi, sweetheart. It's Aunt Melissa. We're planning a family reunion next month. Your parents, Savannah Grandma. Everyone will be there. I'd love for you to come." I stared at the message for a long time. Her name brought back warm memories of holidays she used to host where laughter filled the kitchen, and she always made sure I had a seat at the table, even when my parents forgot. I read the message again. 10 years. 10 years since the night at the bus stop. 10 years since I'd last seen their faces. For a moment, I imagined what it would feel like to walk into that hall to see the same people who had left me standing under a streetlight with $10 and a diploma. Then I thought of all that had come, since the mentors, the long nights, the people who believed in me when my family hadn't. I typed 3 simple words and hit send. I'll be there. In the weeks leading up to the reunion, work consumed every spare moment. Venture capital firms were requesting meetings, partnerships were forming, and SwiftRoot's valuation was climbing faster than I could process. But at night, when the office went quiet, I'd catch myself wondering what it would be like to see them again. Would they recognize me? Would they look at the woman I'd become and remember the girl they'd abandoned? I didn't expect forgiveness from them, but I wanted to see just once if time had taught them anything. The day of the reunion arrived with the faint scent of rain in the air. I chose a slate gray dress, tailored but simple, a silk scarf at my neck, and pearl earrings that had belonged to Miss Alvarez. No designer logos, no displays of wealth, just quiet grace. When the black limousine pulled up outside my apartment, the driver opened the door and asked for the destination. Bloomington, Indiana. I said the name, tasting both strange and familiar. The drive took nearly 4 hours. Through the tinted window, the landscape unfolded like an old memory. Grain silos, weathered barns, the diner sign still flickering near the highway. When we turned onto County Road 12, my chest tightened. The same road, the same fields, even the same crooked streetlight where it had all begun. "Could you slow down?" I asked. The driver eased to a stop beside the old bus stop. The bench had been repainted, the sign replaced, but the air still carried the weight of that night. I rolled down the window and looked out. The words I'd once whispered into the dark came back to me. "If no one gives me a ride, I'll build my own road." The driver glanced in the mirror. "You all right, ma'am?" "Yes," I said quietly, just remembering where the road started. When we reached the community center, the parking lot was full. Laughter drifted through the open doors. The smell of roasted ham and apple pie carried on the breeze. Banners hung along the walls, and framed photos of past reunions lined a long table near the entrance. My name tag waited at the sign-in desk, printed neatly, Nora Gray, SwiftRoot Technologies. The volunteer behind the table smiled. "You're with the sponsor company, right?" she said. "The event tonight is actually made possible by your donation." I paused. "Oh," she pointed to a plaque by the door. It gleamed under the string lights. "This gathering is proudly sponsored by SwiftRoot Technologies and the Gray Initiative." I felt a small, steady pulse of irony. They had no idea the girl they once called ungrateful had quietly paid for the very table they were eating from. Inside, voices rose and fell like waves. I recognized cousins' uncles' faces that had aged but not changed. At the center of it all stood my parents, Carol and Thomas, still side by side, still polished for an audience. My mother's hair had turned silver at the edges, her posture still straight as a ruler. My father's eyes carried the same wary pride I remembered. And beside them, as radiant as ever, stood Savannah, laughing, surrounded by a small circle of admirers. For a moment, I just watched, letting the noise blur into a soft hum. Aunt Melissa spotted me first. She gasped, hand flying to her mouth, then hurried over, tears already glinting in her eyes. "Oh, my word, Nora," she said, clutching my hands. "Or should I say, Ms. Gray?" I smiled gently. "Nora's fine. You look incredible," she whispered. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either," I said. She led me through the crowd, introducing me to relatives who barely recognized me. Some squinted, trying to place the face behind the new name. Others just smiled politely, offering handshakes and compliments. The air buzzed with small talk and music. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt untouchable. As people found their seats for dinner, the host took the stage to thank everyone for attending. Before we began, he said we'd like to thank our anonymous donor for sponsoring tonight's reunion. Without their generosity, this event wouldn't be possible. Applause filled the room. My parents clapped, too unaware they were applauding their own forgotten child. And tonight, he continued, we're proud to announce a new community scholarship, the Bus Stop Fund, dedicated to helping local students in foster care or without family support. The donor requested anonymity, but wanted the message shared. For every child left waiting by the road, may your next stop lead to something better. The words silenced the room. I felt my throat tighten. My mother turned to my father, whispering something I couldn't hear. Savannah gave a soft, skeptical laugh, saying, "That's oddly specific." But the crowd only nodded, touched by the sentiment. I lifted my glass of water and took a slow sip, letting their murmurs fade. The fund wasn't for them. It was for every version of me, still out there sitting under a streetlight somewhere, waiting for a ride that would never come. When the speeches ended, I slipped out to the quiet of the parking lot. The sky had gone deep blue, the pavement still warm from the day's heat. My limousine waited by the curb, its dark frame reflecting the glow of the building behind me. I looked back once at the open doors and the laughter spilling into the night. For the first time, there was no anger in the space between us, just distance clean and unbroken. The driver held the door for me. "Heading out already, ma'am?" he asked. "Not just yet," I said softly. I turned toward the road beyond the lot, the same one that had once carried me away with nothing but a backpack and a promise. The same one that now brought me back quietly on my own terms. I watched the headlights pass and whispered to myself, "Same road, different driver." Then I stepped into the car, the door closing with a soft click. The hum of the engine filled the silence as we pulled away, leaving behind the sound of music chatter and a family that would never quite know who had made their reunion possible. The road ahead shimmered under the streetlights, and I could feel that something was waiting just beyond the next curve, something I had spent 10 years preparing to face. The drive back from Bloomington was quiet, just the hum of the tires and the faint sound of rain tapping against the glass. The limousine's cabin smelled faintly of leather and cedar, clean and distant. I stared out the window, watching the blur of fields and old barns slide past. Somewhere behind me was the family I'd once begged to notice me. Somewhere ahead was the life I'd built without them. It was the first time those two worlds had ever been this close. When I got home to Seattle, a stack of letters waited on my desk. Thank you notes from the reunion committee, donation receipts from the bus stop fund, and a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper in my mother's handwriting. "We saw you, it began. You've done well. We're proud, and we hope we can talk someday." The words looked neat, almost rehearsed, like she'd rewritten them several times before sending them. I placed the letter back in the envelope and set it aside. There was no anger left, only distance, and a quiet kind of understanding that sometimes people don't change, they just age. Work moved fast after that. The article in the business journal spread farther than I expected. My inbox, filled with partnership offers, and investors began calling. One morning I walked into the office to find our receptionist practically glowing. "They want you on the Forbes 40 under 40 list," she said, holding up the email. I laughed, thinking she was joking. But when I read it, there it was, my name confirmed for the upcoming issue. A photograph, an interview, a feature story about women redefining modern logistics. It was surreal standing in the same office where I'd once worked through the night with nothing but a folding chair and a borrowed laptop. A week later, during a meeting, Tom called unexpectedly. His voice carried the same warmth it always had. "Saw the news, kid," he said. "You did it." I smiled. "Couldn't have without you," he chuckled. "Don't start giving credit away now. Just promise me you'll take a break once in a while." I promised, though I didn't mean it. There was still too much to do. Swift Route was expanding into the East Coast, and every day felt like a new test. But with every success came attention, and not all of it was the kind I wanted. My parents began reaching out again. First, it was a voicemail from my father saying they'd love to visit the office just to see how far you've come. Then a message from Savannah, casual and polished, asking if Swift Route needed a legal consultant. Her tone was the same one she'd used when we were teenagers, half compliment, half command. I didn't respond. I'd built this company from nothing. I wasn't about to hand any part of it to people who once treated me as disposable. Still, curiosity has its own gravity. 2 weeks after the Forbes article came out, a security guard buzzed my office. "Ms. Gray, he said there are 2 visitors here insisting they have an appointment with you, Thomas and Carol Blake." I felt the air shift around me. For a long second I didn't move. Then I said, "Have them wait in the conference room. I'll be right there." When I walked in, they were standing side by side like they'd practiced. My father wore a suit that didn't quite fit. My mother clutched her purse with both hands. "Nora," she said, her voice tentative. "It's good to see you." I nodded politely. "You can call me Miss Gray," I said. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They talked first about how proud they were, how remarkable my company had become, how Savannah had mentioned helping with our expansion. The words felt carefully arranged the way people talk when they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. I listened quietly, letting them circle the point. Finally, my father said, "We hoped you might consider hiring your sister. She's been struggling since her firm downsized. You could really make a difference." I leaned back, folding my hands on the table. "You know," I said calmly, "the last time I saw any of you, you left me at a bus stop with $10. My mother's eyes filled, but I didn't stop. "You didn't call. You didn't write. You didn't care if I ever made it home. And now you're asking me to make room for her here." My father's voice hardened. "That was years ago. We were trying to teach you responsibility." "No," I said quietly. "You were teaching me how to survive without you. I learned the lesson." Silence spread between us like fog. My mother reached across the table, but I didn't move. "We just want to fix things," she whispered. "Fixing things starts with acknowledgement," I said. "You can't build on top of the same foundation that broke." I stood, signaling the meeting was over. "I wish you both peace," I said. "But this company, this life, it's not part of your story anymore." Security escorted them out a few minutes later politely and without incident. After they left, I sat alone in the conference room, staring at the skyline beyond the glass. It wasn't triumph, I felt just clarity. There was nothing cruel about distance, it was simply honest. The following week, Swift Route hosted its annual investor gala downtown. The room shimmered with glass and steel, the soft glow of city lights reflecting off every surface. Reporters filled the back wall cameras ready. I stood near the podium waiting for the announcement that would change everything, our merger with a major global logistics partner. When the CEO shook my hand, he smiled and said, "To think all this started with one woman and a map." The applause that followed sounded far away. As the evening wound down, I slipped out to the balcony overlooking the bay. The night air was crisp, the water below catching streaks of light from passing ferries. Behind me, laughter floated from the ballroom, the hum of voices blending with music. I thought of Miss Alvarez closing her diner for the night, of Ben driving along the highway somewhere, of Tom still managing routes at Everline. Every person who had given me a chance had done so without condition. That was what family looked like to me now, people who stayed not because they had to, but because they wanted to. When I returned inside, my assistant handed me my phone. "Another message from your mother?" she said softly. "Do you want me to delete it?" I hesitated. "No," I said. "Save it, but don't respond. I wasn't angry anymore. I just didn't need answers from them. Some stories close quietly without confrontation or applause." That night before leaving the office, I walked into the lobby where the original Swift Route map hung framed on the wall. Next to it, under glass, was the faded $10 bill. Visitors often asked why it was there. I always gave the same reply: "It's the seed that started everything." I stood there for a moment, tracing the glass with my fingertips. The ink had faded over time, but the shape of the number was still clear proof that something small could grow into something lasting if you refused to give up. As I turned off the lights, my reflection appeared in the glass, a woman who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. I whispered softly, "I made it." Then I locked the door and stepped out into the night. The street below shimmered from a light drizzle, the kind that smelled of rain and renewal. Somewhere in the distance, a bus hissed as it pulled to a stop, headlights glowing through the mist. And for a fleeting second, it felt like everything had come full circle. But deep down, I knew there was still one thing left undone, a conversation that hadn't happened, a truth that needed to be spoken out loud. The road wasn't finished yet. It was just bending toward its final turn. The message came 3 weeks after that night in the office. It was short, just a few lines from Aunt Melissa asking if I'd consider meeting with my father. "He's been trying to reach you," she wrote. "It's important this time." At first I ignored it. The past had taken enough from me. But she called the next morning, her voice soft and steady. "Nora," she said, "he's sick. It's his heart. They don't know how much time he has." The words settled heavy in the air. I hadn't spoken to my father since the day he walked out of my conference room, angry and ashamed. Yet the thought of him lying somewhere in a hospital bed, gray, fragile, and quiet, unraveled something I didn't realize I'd been holding so tightly. I told her I'd think about it, then spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything. That evening, the city outside my window looked different, muted somehow. The usual rhythm of car lights and fairy horns felt far away. I sat at my desk, staring at the framed $10 bill again. The ink had faded almost to nothing. It wasn't forgiveness that drew me back home, it was closure. 2 days later, I flew to Indiana. Aunt Melissa met me at the airport, her smile kind but tired. The drive to the hospital passed in silence, the winter fields stretched out under a pale sky. When we pulled into the parking lot, I saw my mother waiting by the entrance. Her hair had gone completely silver, her shoulders drawn in like the world had shrunk around her. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice trembling. I nodded, and we walked the long hallway together, the air thick with antiseptic and memory. My father lay in a private room, tubes winding from his arms, the steady beep of a monitor breaking the silence. His face was thinner, older, the strength that once filled every word now reduced to shallow breaths. For a moment I just stood there watching. Then his eyes opened, and he saw me. "Nora." He rasped the syllables, catching in his throat. I pulled a chair closer. "You look different. Life does that," I said quietly. He tried to smile but winced instead. "I saw your story in that magazine," he said. "Never thought I'd see the day." His voice cracked on the last word. "You left me at a bus stop," I replied, not out of cruelty, but honesty. The memory hung between us like fog. He nodded slowly. "I know. I've replayed it more times than I can count. Your mother and I, we thought we were teaching you to be strong." His hand trembled. "We were wrong." For a long time, neither of us spoke. Machines clicked softly in the background. Then he said, "I wanted to tell you that before." He didn't finish the sentence. I leaned forward, watching his chest rise and fall. "You don't owe me words," I said. "You owe yourself peace." His eyes filled, and for the first time I saw not the man who'd abandoned me, but a tired, frightened human being trying to make sense of his own mistakes. He asked about the company, about Seattle, about whether I was happy. I answered simply. When he reached for my hand, I let him. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. We talked for nearly an hour before the nurse reminded me visiting time was over. As I stood to leave, he whispered, "I'm proud of you, Nora, truly proud." Outside, my mother sat on a bench near the vending machines. When she saw me, her eyes filled, but she didn't speak. I sat beside her, and for the first time in years, neither of us tried to fill the silence. It was enough just to sit there, two women bound by what they'd lost and what they could never regain. I stayed in town for 3 days. The night before I flew home, Aunt Melissa hosted dinner at her house, just the three of us. The smell of roast chicken filled the kitchen, the same scent that once meant comfort. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, the town or garden. When my mother reached for my hand across the table, I didn't pull away. She said softly, "You became everything we hoped you'd be, even without us." I looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Maybe because of it." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. When I left for the airport the next morning, the sky was gray and full of wind. My father was still in the hospital asleep when I stopped by to say goodbye. I left a note on the table beside his bed. It said, "Thank you for seeing me." Back in Seattle, life resumed its pace. Swift Route signed 2 major contracts that month, and the company prepared for expansion overseas. But through it all, I carried that visit quietly like a stone in my pocket. Some days it felt heavy, other days grounding. 3 months later, I got the call. Aunt Melissa's voice was steady but soft. "He's gone, sweetheart." It was peaceful. I flew back that weekend for the funeral. The service was small, the church simple. Rows of worn pews and the faint scent of lilies. My mother sat in the front, hands folded tightly, Savannah beside her looking composed but distant. When the pastor invited me to speak, I hesitated, then walked to the podium. "I used to think strength meant standing alone," I began, "but I've learned it also means knowing when to let go of anger." I looked down at the wooden casket, the polished surface reflecting the light from the stained glass above. My father wasn't perfect. None of us are. But I'm grateful for the part of him that taught me resilience. It carried me farther than either of us could have imagined. The words weren't rehearsed. They just came. When I stepped down, I caught my mother's eye. She nodded once, tears slipping freely now. Savannah stayed seated, her expression unreadable. After the service, I stood by the cemetery gate as people drifted away. The spring wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain. Aunt Melissa hugged me tightly. "You gave him peace," she said. I wasn't sure if that was true, but I hoped it was. That night, I stayed in a small inn just outside town. Through the window, I could see the same stretch of highway that once led me away from everything I knew. Trucks passed in the distance, their headlights glowing faintly through the mist. I thought about Ben's routes, about Tom's maps, about every mile that had brought me here. Before turning in, I opened my laptop and drafted an internal memo for SwiftRoute. Starting that year, the company would launch a scholarship in my father's name, the Thomas Blake Resilience Award, dedicated to helping underprivileged youth enter careers in transportation and logistics. I didn't need to announce the reason publicly. The gesture was enough. The next morning, as I drove to the airport, I took one final detour. County Road 12 stretched quiet under the pale dawn light. I stopped at the old bus stop, new paint, same spot. The air smelled of wet earth and early spring. From my purse, I pulled a small bouquet of white daisies and laid them on the bench. Beside them, I set a folded note that simply said, "Thank you for the lesson." Then I stood there for a while, listening to the wind moving through the grass. It wasn't grief, I felt it was release. For the first time, the memory of that night didn't ache. It just existed, part of a story that had finally come full circle. As I turned back toward the car, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, catching on the glass of the windshield. I smiled faintly and whispered, "The road's clear now." When I started the engine, the hum of the tires on the pavement sounded steady, almost familiar, like the world saying it was time to move forward again. The flight home felt lighter than the one that had brought me back. I watched the clouds drift below white against the endless blue, and realized how different the sky looked when you weren't running from something. For the first time in years, there was no weight pressing on my chest, only calm. Somewhere below those clouds, the town that had once been my whole world was now just another dot on the map. When I landed in Seattle, the city lights shimmered across the bay like scattered glass. My driver was waiting at the curb, the same quiet man who'd driven me to that family reunion months before. As we wound through the familiar streets, I thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't. The roads were still the same, but I was not the girl who had walked them all those years ago with $10 in her pocket. Back at my apartment, the view stretched over the skyline, cranes and bridges glinting under the night sky. On my desk sat the framed $10 bill, still faded but steady, and beside it a photo of the SwiftRoute team at our last company event, smiling, arms around each other, eyes bright with pride. That was my family now, not by blood, but by choice. People who saw me not for what I came from, but for what I built. The next morning, I went into the office early. The halls were quiet sunlight spilling across the polished floor. On the lobby wall, the new plaque for the Thomas Blake Resilience Award had just been mounted. I stood in front of it for a long moment, tracing the engraved letters with my fingertips. It felt right, not as forgiveness, but as completion. A recognition that every part of my story, even the hardest parts, had shaped what stood here now. Later that day, the SwiftRoute board meeting began. We reviewed numbers, discussed new expansions, and confirmed our next project, a mentorship initiative for young women starting in logistics. Every route starts somewhere, I told the team. Sometimes it just needs a map. They smiled, understanding what I meant without me having to explain. That evening I drove out to the coast. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the horizon burned orange with the setting sun. I parked by the cliffs and sat on the hood of my car, the wind lifting my hair, the ocean stretching forever ahead. For a while I said nothing. I just listened to the waves, to the distant gulls, to the quiet that finally felt like peace. So much of my life had been about proving I could survive. Now it was about learning to simply live, to wake up without old anger tugging at my ribs, to celebrate without guilt, to remember without bitterness. The people who had broken me hadn't won, they had simply taught me where to draw my boundaries and how to rebuild from the ground up. I still thought about that night, sometimes the rain, the flickering street light, the sound of tires fading into the dark. But when I pictured it now, I didn't see loss. I saw a beginning. That girl sitting on the cold bench had no idea what waited for her, how far she'd go, or how strong she'd become. She only knew she couldn't stay where she was, and sometimes that's enough. Before heading home, I took out my phone and opened the Notes app. I typed a single line, the one truth that had carried me through every twist and setback. You don't owe anyone your silence, your forgiveness, or your future. You owe yourself peace. Then I hit save. As I drove back toward the city, the highway lights blurred into a steady glow. The world outside my window felt wide and open again, full of roads I hadn't yet traveled. Somewhere behind me, a younger version of myself was still waiting at that bus stop, wondering if her life would ever start. I wanted to tell her it already had. If you've ever been left behind or made to feel small, remember this: where you start doesn't decide where you end up. Every step forward, no matter how hard, is still progress, and someday you'll look back and see how far you've come. Thank you for listening to my story. If it found a piece of truth in yours, take a moment to share it or just sit quietly and let it settle. Sometimes that's all a story like this needs to be heard, and to remind someone that they're not alone.